Right, so welcome to part three of the BGA FRTOL course. You'll find probably that the first three parts of the course actually teach you pretty much most of what you need to know as a glider pilot flying around. Next week, we're going to be looking at what happens if you're flying a TMG or some other powered airplane. So some of that stuff. And the week after, we'll be looking at emergencies and things like that. But the first 3 weeks really are about getting yourself around as a cross-country glider pilot. I'm going to try and share my screen. Okay. Excellent. So Paul Hayho, can you just nod if you can see my my presentation? Paul, just wave or nod. Yep. Okay, good. So we've got a presentation. Excellent. So part three. What we're going to do today is recap on some of the part three topics. So that's transponders, a little bit about the services of different sorts, talk about MATS penetration, and Class D zone clearances, which really just build on the things that we did over the last 2 weeks. Next week, we'll touch on how to get in and out of an ATZ if you want to go and land there. I'll give some opportunities for questions. And in the breakouts, we're going to be looking at the MATS penetration and the Class D zone clearance. Okay, so let's start off then with transponders and secondary surveillance radar. So just to recap, you should have covered this in the material you've looked at. So what we're talking about here is what most radar services are going to use. So rather than what's called a primary radar return, where they send out a pulse of energy and see what comes back by reflection, actually most air traffic control radars use secondary signals. And what happens there is they send out an interrogation signal and the aircraft sends a signal back, and the signal has some information in it. So it's not a reflection. They trigger a transmission and look and see where it comes from. Now, the problem with primary returns is that a lot of the gliders that we fly actually don't reflect very well, so they give a very weak primary radar return. So often you can't be seen by a primary radar. And a radar from the ground can't detect altitude very easily. The military have radars that will do that because enemies aren't always helpful in terms of saying where they are. But most air traffic control radars don't. What they do is they transmit a strong secondary signal, which includes the flight level, providing we have set the transponder to alt, and a manually set squawk code. So there it is. We've set up 7,000 on this transponder. And you should use whatever squawk the controller gives you. But if they don't give you one, you can use a conspicuity code, and 7,000 is one of the conspicuity codes. And then the other thing we've got on here is that we've put the call sign of the aircraft, and in this case, that's Golf Tango Romeo India Golf. This is a trig transponder. So that information gets sent as well on a Mode S transponder, which is what all the modern ones are. So we've got the number that's sent, the squawk code. We've got the identity of the aircraft, and we've got the flight level based on the 1013 standard pressure setting that the aircraft is at. If you're asked to squawk ident, you press the ident button, this IDT button here. But you only do that if you're asking for it, if you're asked for it. Okay. What the controller sees on their screen is something like this. So we've got contacts here. This one's a contact, and here's the squawk code 7,000. Here's another contact, and this this one is squawking a different number, and here's the altitude that it's at, and you can see that it's left a track on the screen. The language we use here is we're asked to squawk a particular number, like squawk 7,000, so we set that code as instructed. Now, we've always got to have the altitude on, unless we're told not to. So just turning the transponder to on isn't good enough. And that's a big gotcha on the way that these things are designed. So always have altitude set. So the example of the language will be glider Charlie Delta squawk 6201. The response is squawk 6201, glider Charlie Delta, because the squawk is one of the mandatory readbacks. If you don't have a transponder, you can say negative transponder, glider Charlie Delta. They've some other language that they can use, squawk code with altitude. They're telling you to make sure that the altitude is turned on. They might ask you to confirm squawk, tell them what you've set. Reset squawk means reselect the assigned code, and squawk ident means press that ident button. And squawk standby, select the standby feature. These are rarely used. Generally, they just tell you to squawk. Okay, so we've got a few questions. Nidge says yachts hang radar reflectors off their masts. They're not heavy. Have they ever been used in gliders? I'm not sure, Nidge. I guess it would be possible, but actually most people don't have primary radar, so it wouldn't be terribly useful. Catriona asks if it's important to avoid scrolling through emergency squawk codes by accident while going to a new squawk. You probably don't want to stay on them, but actually switching reasonably fast isn't a problem, because I think it takes a little while before the transponder realizes that you're in the right place. Actually, on the trig that we were just looking at, you've got to get to the end before you press the button. It's only the old style transponders where you're selecting each digit individually where that's an issue. David says, if you have a transponder, for example, a trig TT21, am I correct in thinking you don't also need a Sky Echo 2? They largely do different things, David. Although the trig TT21 can be an ADSB out device, so that's going to transmit ADSB as well as the Mode S, and so that would replace some of the Sky Echo 2's functionality. John asks whether with a Mode S transponder, does it matter if the GPS source is non-certified? Largely no, John, it doesn't. Tony asks, has FLARM got a use? Can ATC see them? FLARM has very good uses, mostly about avoiding hitting gliders. For air traffic purposes, occasionally actually, sometimes air traffic units might have a little iPad on the side where they can keep some track of gliders. It's not official though. Bruce says, has anyone ever used ground? Not in a glider, I suspect, Bruce. So there's a function called ground which can transmit a particular code that says you're on the ground. So it's probably appropriate for airliners going around airfields. Okay, good. So that's a quick run through transponders. I don't know, about 10% of gliders have got transponders. They're really useful if you've got one, but they're moderately expensive. It's probably a couple of K to have one by the time it's fitted with antennas and things. But really useful if you're flying around places with lots of fast jets or heavy aeroplanes flying around. Makes me much more comfortable flying around Lakenheath and Mildenhall, for example. Okay, so coaches, please remember to put a star in front of your name. And I'm just going to discover whether Phil is here, and he's not, so there's going to be a pause while I set up the breakout groups at the end of this. Okay. All right, let's talk about services. So the one that we've been dealing with so far is the basic service. It's what we would normally ask for as a glider pilot. What, where, and who? So an air traffic service unit can give pilots information useful for the safe and efficient conduct of flights, is the way they put it. It might include some unsolicited traffic information, but don't bet on it. That's not the contract you've made with them. Perhaps more importantly, what the basic service does is give us, the pilot, a framework to tell busy nearby airfields about our position and our intended route. So that will help an ATSU that doesn't have radar or a glider that isn't squawking because it doesn't have a transponder. It can be provided to BFR and IFR flights in Class G airspace. So that's us. We are typically VFR and we're typically in Class G. And people in Class E controlled airspace can get it as well. That's a thing that's more likely up in Scotland. It can be provided by air traffic control officers or FISOs, but not by air ground operators. And when you want one is if you're going past a busy licensed airfield in Class G, so Cambridge or Cranfield or somewhere like that, maybe Benson, places where it's worth talking to them, but it's really about just letting them know where you are and them telling you anything important. So that's a basic service. Your obligations, very little. You can maneuver as you wish, unless you've agreed some specific limitation. They might have asked you not to go above a certain level, for example, for coordination with other aircraft, in which case you shouldn't do that without agreeing it with them. So if you fly over the top of Oxford Airport when they've got instrument traffic, they might ask you to limit how high you are, either not below or not above. And once you've agreed that, you shouldn't break that agreement without telling them that you're going to have to. If you're asked to report your position, you should reply your call sign. So there's a formal reply to a report position, and there's what we would normally do in a glider. So the formal reply is a call sign, current position, the position at a given time, your level, and then your next waypoint and ETA. The important bits of those for a glider pilot, the call sign, are your current position and level. You can tell an ATSU to stand by if you're busy. That's useful. And if you have a separate GPS screen for your QDM, your bearing from the airfield you're talking to and range, that can lessen your workload as well. So if I dial up an airfield on my LX, it will tell me what range and distance I am from that airfield. So that makes it very easy for me to tell them where I am in relation to them. We need to call if we're leaving the frequency or changing to somewhere else before we leave the frequency. And avoiding other traffic remains our responsibility. They've got no obligation to give you any sort of traffic information whatsoever. You can get a basic service from London or Scottish Information, and these are the frequencies certainly of a day or so of a year or two back, and I'm not sure if the boundaries have changed at all. Examiners might ask you to do that in the test. It's not very useful in the real world for gliders. You get a lot of people calling London Information just to get a basic service, but it's covering a big area, so it's not very helpful. Where it might be useful for us is if we wanted to clarify a NOTAM or find out the status of some piece of airspace that we're about to get close to a danger area or something. Might be worth asking London Information for that sort of information. If you're up in Scotland, you might take a different view of this, particularly if you're in a remote area and you want somebody to talk to if you're going to get into trouble there. But southern part of the country, we're probably not going to be talking to these guys very much. You can find these coverage maps in the AIP in section 6.32 and 6.33. also in the Skyway code, which is a good read if you haven't looked at it. I talked a little bit about position reports. So in the exam, you might get asked to report reaching a known point. There's one in the week 2 script. Report north of beam Oxford. A beam means at right angles to the track. So you can respond Wilco to that request. It's not a mandatory readback, that whole thing. But when you get there, as I said a slide or two ago, you give the call sign, the position that you were at a given time, what your current level is, and your next waypoint and ETA. So glider Charlie Delta, Bury St Edmunds at 47, so that's 47 minutes past the current hour. Altitude 4,000 feet, Ely 01. So I'm expecting to be at Ely at 01 minutes past the hour. That's what you do in the test if asked for it. In reality, what you would say is glider Charlie Delta, Bury St Edmunds, altitude 4,000 feet, next turning point, Ely. This form of the thing is really designed for procedural flying in airways, where aircraft are flying at a known speed from point A to point, from a waypoint to waypoint. So this means that providing you log the fact that you went past one waypoint at a given time, then you've got the format for your position report for most of the rest of the leg. And the air traffic controller can work out roughly where you are based on the difference between this time and that time and the current time. For us, though, we really don't know how fast we're going to get to the next waypoint with any degree of accuracy. So typically, we'll call when we're at the waypoint. If it was 10 minutes ago and we'd moved quite a lot, then it might be saying Bury St Edmunds at the time that we went past Bury. So a couple of options there. This one for the exam, this one for real life. If you ask for a basic service, the air traffic service unit can say no. They're unable. It's very rare. If it happens, don't worry. You can just acknowledge with Roger leaving the frequency, or just stay on and listen to what happens. The one time I've heard it happen a couple of times. One is when I tried to ask an air ground service unit for one, and they rightly said they couldn't provide it. So that's fair enough. The other time was when the controller was so stretched with loads of people, he just didn't have the capacity to give anybody else a service. So I didn't get one. Okay, so if you call a radio, they will say unable. Other flight information services, there's a traffic service, and that really requires radar on their part and a transponder on your part. And they will give you information about traffic. Generally, people who've got transponders, sometimes people from a primary radar return, who they think might affect you. And it's quite a big bubble that they put around you, 2 or 3 miles and a couple of thousand feet. So if you're on a busy gliding day, you're going to get a lot of traffic information if you ask for that. So it's probably not a sensible thing to do for a glider. There's a thing called a deconfliction service, which is IFR only, where they will not only tell you about the traffic, but they'll try and give you headings to fly to avoid it. That is not doable on a busy day. There's a procedural service, and you'll come across quite a lot of people on a procedural service. So if you go through Cambridge or Cranfield, when they don't have radar, they will be routing people using a procedural service. So they'll clear somebody to the hold at a given altitude, and that's their bit of sky. And then they'll clear them to a waypoint, and then the bit between the hold and the waypoint is their bit of sky, and they make sure that nobody else who is also on this procedural service is in that bit of sky. So there's the course slides, and CAT 1434 can give you more information on that. If you ask for a traffic service without a transponder, you'll probably get a basic service anyway. But the service type is a mandatory readback. So if they say glider Charlie Delta basic service, you have to reply basic service as part of your next message. Okay, So let's go on to questions. Right. Adrian asks, did you say that lots of air traffic units simply don't have primary radar at all? That is, radar don't even show up weekly. We should simply assume that they don't know about it at all. Yes, I think that's correct, Adrian. Some only use secondary radar. Or the primary radar is set up if they do have it, is set up in a way that we're probably not going to appear on it. So they will use Doppler radar and only detect things that are moving fast enough, for example, and that generally doesn't include us. Katriona says, don't replies usually have the call sign at the end? Is this an exception? Sorry, Katriona, I don't know which one you're referring to now.
I'm referring to.
What I said, I'll try and answer.
Can you hear me?
Said, would London Information be able to give you the frequency of the airfield you're near? Yeah, but you ought to have it, really. You oughtn't be relying on London Information. It's going to be quite hard work to call London Information and get the frequency and then call the airfield. But they would. Anthony says, do we also give our altimeter setting during the formal position report? No, you've already done that. You're already talking to the air traffic controller. So you've agreed the frequency, the QNH you're using. You wouldn't do it again on any other altitude report. David asks something similar. Chris asks something similar. Okay. Bruce gives us information. Josh Martin has got a star at the end of his name by mistake. Josh, you might want to put it at the beginning of your name, otherwise you're going to end up in the wrong place. Okay. James says, if you ask an ATSU to stand by, can you just continue with the response they asked for? Or do you need to ask them to repeat or similar when you're ready to talk? It sort of depends on the context, I think, James. If they said, for example, Glider Charlie Delta, report your position, you could say stand by because you don't know where you are, work out where you are, and then call them and say, Glider Charlie Delta is at this position. So you can just go in with that. Generally, I think if you say stand by, you can then come back and continue the conversation when you're ready. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I muted the. Thank you, Bruce. I've turned my volume up again. I muted it because my computer was making noise. So if you need to talk to me now, you can do that. Claudia says, if I can't see reported traffic and say traffic not sighted, does that get them worried? No, not in the slightest. If you say traffic sighted, I think they'll stop reporting it to you. If you say traffic not sighted, which is quite likely on the first call, because generally they call it at about 3 miles. And I don't know about you, I can't see traffic at 3 miles most of the time. Then they might call it again if they think it's really getting close to you. I don't think they're going to be worried about it, but they will have figured out you haven't seen it yet. Okay. Andrew says, if not using basic services and opening requests, what should you ask for from a radio service? So this is dependent on what you're trying to do, Andrew. If we're just going past somewhere, then basic service is a good start. If it was somebody radio, so it's an air ground communication service, then we'd ask for airfield information. If we had some other request, like we wanted to go land there, we'd ask to join, a request join. So very dependent on what we want to do. Okay. Claudia says, traffic in sight or traffic not sighted? Yeah, that's correct, Claudia. Sonny says, earlier you said the controller could ask for a basic service to the glider pilot. No, the controller isn't asking us for basic service. The controller is telling us he or she is going to give us a basic service. Bruce has given me an example of a call to London Information, which is fine. London Information, glider Golf, Bravo Uniform Sierra Yankee, no service required. Request danger area, spade Adam status. There you go. That's what you'd say. Okay. Any other questions on that? And I do have my volume turned up now. Okay, Neville, yeah, I haven't forgotten that. There's a slide on it shortly. Right, quick look round. So let's talk a bit about MATSs. So a MATS is a military air traffic zone. Confusingly, it has an air traffic zone within it usually. So this is an area surrounding many military airfields. It's the same class as the surrounding airspace. In theory, civilian aircraft need no clearance to enter, but it's good airmanship to request MATS penetration. So theoretically, this is airspace applicable to military aircraft, but we treat it a bit more seriously than not using it at all. Here's one of the rules that you need to know, but we will do it a bit differently. So the book says you should call them the earlier of 15 nautical miles or 5 minutes from the boundary. So it's the earlier of those. But often, if we're cross country, we're moving so slowly that this might be quite a long time before we get there. So it might well be that we're talking to somebody else at this point. And giving them a bit of warning is useful, but here we might be with someone else. They might say MATS penetration approved. It's not a clearance. Examiners will expect it to be read back. So if you get that in the exam, if they say MATS penetration approved, then read it back as if it were a clearance. In real life, maybe less important. Now, don't forget that MATSs contain ATZs that do require separate entry approval. And you can't go, whilst you can, in theory, go into a MATS without asking, you cannot go into the ATZ without asking. Generally, these are all military units. They will be talking to military aircraft via UHF radio, and you won't hear the aircraft RT. They may do what's called bandboxing, and so you'll hear them making the calls. What you won't hear is the response. When you call them, you can request the basic service at the same time as you ask for MATS penetration. And be ready to tell them where you are, including your level. So let's have a look at a couple of MATSs. Down in the bottom right here, we've got Watersham, and this is a typical MATS. So this is 5 miles diameter, and there are 5 mile stubs on the end. So it's really designed to have some sort of instrument approach to the host airfield, and these stubs are on the line of the main active runway. Up here, we've got what's called a combined MATS. There's 2 airfields, and they have overlapping MATSs, and there's one frequency that you talk to for the whole combined MATS, and here it is, CMATS 128.9. And then in both cases, in red in the middle, here and here, you can see the air traffic zone. So you can, in theory, go into this without asking. You cannot go into that without asking. Okay, so if we wanted to go into Lakenheath MATS, we can find the frequency from our radio, from the CEA frequency reference card, sorry, the NATS frequency reference card, from the AIP, from the chart. Now look at where it was in the chart. So tune the radio, listen for a while, see who's talking, and then request basic service and MATS penetration. And then before you leave, you need to tell them that you've gone or that you're going. For Lakenheath, for those who fly around there's a few practical tips, and it's worth understanding the differences between different airfields, different military airfields, because they all behave quite differently. So Lakenheath, generally staffed by American United States Air Force controllers, and their job is to control the F-15s, the F-35s, the helicopters, the tankers, the transports that they've got coming in. They're radar controllers and they expect a transponder. They don't stay at the base very long, a couple of years sometimes, I think, and they're not very familiar with Cat 413. You don't tend to get standard RT from them. They can be very busy on other frequencies. They have quiet times and then they launch 30 aircraft in one go. So they get very busy. My experience is that their MAT isn't very important to them. What's important to them is where their climb outs and approaches are. And if you're going past there, if you fly in that area, it's worth learning where those are, because there are points where they'll vector all their fast jets back through. So if you're there at the appropriate height, you're going to see a lot of fast jets. You might not get classic Cat 413 responses. May or may not get a service. If you've got a transponder, it's going to work much better. They'll probably give you essentially a traffic service. And if you've got a transponder, after your initial call, you might just get something back like radar contact max penetration approved as the initial response. If you haven't got a transponder, they'll acknowledge you, give you a basic service, but you probably won't get hugely much from it. Other MATs, again, vary quite a lot. Some are quite precious about the MATs. Some will let you through without any problem whatsoever. That's a sort of practical life learning thing that you've got to do. Okay, so let's pick up some questions. Okay, let's see. James points out that primary and secondary radar are superimposed on each other. Yeah, that's true. Glider, Cambridge is a good example. Glider, certainly with their new radar, gliders just generally often won't appear on their primary. I think that's the main point I'm trying to make. James says cross-coupling for VHF, UHF, bandboxing will not transmit on the other frequency. Okay, I think we're hearing so you're not, I think that's my point, James. If there's a fast jet on a UHF frequency, you're not going to hear their responses. What you often hear out of Lakenheath say is the controller talking to the fast jet or the big heavy or something. Bruce says 5 nautical miles radius, not diameter. That's correct. I thought I said that. Obviously got confused. Adam asks for an ATZ entry request. What would the phrasing be? Would it be request ATZ penetration? I'd probably use the word entry, actually. But penetration would work. Callum asks, in the exam, would you be penalised for reading back things that aren't mandatory readbacks? I think you'd lose points, Callum. The aim is not to say stuff you don't need to. Paul says, Paul, when you talk about match, you use penetration, but elsewhere it's transit. Yeah, I don't know why that is. Well, I know why it is. It's what it does in Cat 413. But I don't know why it's like that. David says, how do you listen for the QNH? So if you go onto if you join a frequency and don't start talking immediately, and somebody else does start talking, often the QNH will be swapped in that conversation because they'll make an initial call, they'll get the QNH. So now you know what the QNH is and you can set it before you make the call, which makes life easier. Jin says, for Mats, I thought I'd read that ensuring you're set to their QFE was highly important. Not always, Jin. Very often you can stay on QNH. Certainly the Americans won't use anything other than QNH. Some of the British ones, if you go across the top of their ATZ, they'll ask you to, and so the ATZ, not the MATs, they'll ask you to set the QFE. What sometimes happens in for some military matches is you'll get what's called the regional pressure setting, which I don't really want to go into now, but it's worth understanding what it is. It's not very useful for glider pilots. Boom, 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 boom. Okay, James has given me a Cat 413 reference, but I know what it's for. David says, can you clarify what you mean by level? I mean by level, it's the generic term for all the other things you mentioned, altitude, height, or flight level. So we refer to those generically as the level, and it depends on what the appropriate one to use is at the time. So if we say it's the level and you've been asked to set the QFE, then it's the height. If you're on QNH, it's the altitude. And if you're on the standard pressure setting, it would be the flight level. Adrian points out that some radios have a dual watch function, which can help in picking up the QNH before you switch to that frequency as the active one. Yeah, I find that really useful, that dual watch function really useful, Adrian. I'm very often flying around with two frequencies set, maybe my gliding chat frequency in whichever airfield I'm going past at the time. So, okay, any other questions on that? Let's move on to Class D airfields then. So let's talk about crossing Class D. Here's a bit of Class D. It's the one we're going to use in the breakouts. This is Bryce Norton. And you can see that Bryce, being the Royal Air Force's training operation, transport operation. They have all the big aircraft going in and out of there. They've got a bit of Class D to protect them. They don't have an ATZ in the middle of it. So it's just this piece of Class D. It's quite a complicated piece of airspace. We have Oxford Airport up here, which is very busy, which has instrument approaches which run through it. We've got a Fairford down here, which has a MATS, which is NOTAM activated, so that's only occasionally in use. We've got Benson over here, and Little Rizzy and various other places, Western on the Green parachuting. So busy place. But they haven't got so many aircraft that it's not possible to get a clearance to go through here. And the point about Class D is that we absolutely must have a clearance. It's not like a MATS where it's not a legal requirement before you go in. If you just dip a toe into this, you must have a clearance. Otherwise, you're doing an airspace bust and the CAA get awfully upset. So Class D, it's varying shapes, and they surrounds many airports with commercial air traffic of whatever sort. So Norwich, Bristol, Aberdeen, Bryce Norton. I think Donington's going to come back and places like that. We must get a clearance. So we're going to get the frequency that we're going to use from the radio, the frequency card, or the chart. We're going to request a zone crossing, or I've actually used the word penetration here, 10 minutes before the boundary. We should give the flight rules we want, either VFR or IFR, in the initial call, but if we're a glider, they will assume we want a VFR crossing, but we should put in VFR. And if and when cleared, we're going to read the clearance back in full with our call sign on the end. If we don't get it right, they'll tell us it again. If we didn't write it down properly, ask the controller to say again. There are three types of clearance that you can get. You can get an IFR clearance, a VFR clearance, or a special VFR clearance. Almost certainly we're going to use a VFR clearance. For an IFR clearance, we must have a MODES transponder. A VFR clearance means we're going to remain 1,000 feet vertically and 1,500 meters horizontally from cloud if we're above 3,000 feet above sea level or 1,000 feet above ground. And special VFR, we're going to be inside of the surface and clear of the cloud. So that's a restriction. That might affect us. This one might be useful, but it puts more constraints on what they can do. When we enter the airspace, they will say glider Charlie Delta radar control. So we're no longer on a basic service, traffic service. They are services outside of controlled airspace, and now we're inside controlled airspace, and we're going to get radar control. It doesn't mean that they're going to tell you exactly what to do, but it means that you must do what you've agreed with them in the clearance. They're only guaranteeing in Class D IFR, IFR separation and IFR special VFR separation. Theoretically, VFR traffic is see and avoid. So staying clear of other traffic remains your responsibility. If there's two gliders, they're not going to stop you hitting each other. They will definitely try and keep you away from IFR traffic, though, certainly as a glider. We've negotiated with the CAA, and this is in the air traffic manuals, that if we're a glider, they can expect us to deviate a couple of nautical miles or 30 degrees off track or to stop to thermal unless they tell us otherwise. So even though you've got a clearance through Class D, you can do all the normal things.
Find the other length, yeah. It's the square root of the two squares.
You might get an altitude restriction or request or a lateral limitation. Sorry about these slides. I've obviously got a button pressed wrong. So they might say not above altitude 4,000 feet, QNH 1020. They might say remain east of the ATZ, or not below height 3,000 feet, airfield QFE 9908 hectopascals. So those are all parts of your clearance, and they are mandatory once you've agreed them. If for some reason you're unable to comply, if you've got a knot below and you screw it up and you're going to go down through that, tell them as soon as possible. Tell them before you get there, preferably, before you break the restriction. Don't pretend it never happened. So fess up. Tell them you can't do what you agreed to. Okay, so in the breakouts, we're going to look at Lakenheath, and you're going to get a max penetration approval from various positions, and you're going to get a BRISE and get a Class D crossing clearance. So coaches, if you start with the simple requests, approval clearances and so on, you can try different combinations of transponders or no transponder. You can look for other requests, give traffic information, QNH. So you've got the maps on the course materials pages for you to use for that. Right, so let's just see if there's any last questions. Gary says, VFR, special VFR. Surely we would choose special VFR. Probably not, Gary. On most days that we're flying, special VFR is generally for poor visibility, and it imposes a demand on the controller, for example, extra separation requirements. So you're more likely to get a clearance if you ask for VFR. Nidge says, is there no waiver for gliders near cloud, given gliders thermal under clouds, generally outside Class D? There is a waiver outside Class D, Nidge, in that as far as gliders are concerned, we can fly what is technically IMC, and that is technically IMC if we get close to cloud above 3,000 feet, and we don't need any special license to do it. If we fly in cloud, which is also technically IMC, then we need, or at least we will need, a cloud flying rating for it, but we can still do it. So yes, there are some waivers for gliders. In Class D, they don't apply. So theoretically, at least in Class D, we have to maintain that separation from the cloud. Okay. Louis says, when you get told radar control, is this a different frequency? No, it'll be as you pass the boundary, they will say glider Charlie Delta, entered controlled airspace, radar control. And then you respond, radar control, glider Charlie Delta. Anthony says the slides talk about a zone penetration for Class D airspace. Yeah, it should be I think it probably should be a zone transit. I think penetration and transit sort of get used interchangeably. Jordan says, is remain east of the ATZ a mandatory readback item? Yes, it's part of a clearance. He says it's not listed under the CRAS acronym. Yes, it is. It's C for clearance, and all of the clearance you repeat back the whole clearance. David says, are you more likely to get a Class D clearance if you have a transponder? Yes, you are much more likely. Sarah says, is it essential to say squawk before the code you're given, or sufficient to say just the code number? Strictly, you should say squawk. So if they say squawk 7000, you say squawk 7000 glider Charlie Delta. Actually, most of the time people will drop squawk. But for the exam, use the word squawk. Okay. Right, for next time, review the Part 4 course material. So we're getting onto the TNG flight now. So we're going to recover some stuff that will be useful to you as straight glider pilots, and that's going to include the ATZ entry and landing. That is really useful. Lets you go places you wouldn't be able to now. But then we're getting onto things where you're flying a powered aircraft. So we're going to talk about taxi commands and things like that. And then the session afterwards, we'll look at emergencies. So these are things that are perhaps beyond what we need as a day-to-day glider pilot, but they're absolutely essential if you want to do the FRTOL. Okay, so that's our last opportunity to get any questions.
Paul, Katrina, question?
Yeah, go.
The question I was referring to, when I asked earlier about the call sign being at the end, I was referring to the earlier position report format where you stated that where it was like where the air traffic operator asked for a position report and the reply started with a call sign, whereas usually responses to something initiated by the air traffic unit end with the call sign.
I think that would depend a little bit on when they asked. So if they said, if when we talked to them, they said, let me get rid of that. If when we talked to them, they said report passing Bury St Edmunds or report north of Beam the airfield. So 10 minutes later, we come up with that position report. Then I'd put it at the front. If they said, glider Charlie Delta, report your position, then I put it at the end because I'm responding directly to them. It's a subtlety. I've never had a convincing explanation of why we do things that way round. One of the more experienced people on the call might want to make that suggestion, but that's the way it is. And there are times when it really isn't obvious which way around it is, and it probably doesn't matter that much if you can't work it out. But broadly, if we're directly responding to a question and giving some information back, or repeating back something they've said, then we stick the call sign on the end. Is that okay?
Okay, thank you, Roger.
Okay, any other questions? Right, okay. I'm going to suggest we take a brief break at this point, mostly because I've got to set up the breakout groups, and from experience, it took me about 7 minutes last time. So it's now 21 past. So come back in about 7 minutes, and I'll try and press the go button.